We tend to treat disease often after it happens. We build drugs to manage symptoms, optimize for chronic management, and design clinical trials around populations that have already gotten sick. Well, the more important window might be well before any of that. My guest today spent years studying microbial systems and coral reefs before bringing that same ecological thinking to the human gut microbiome. Nikole Kimes is the co-founder and CEO of Siolta Therapeutics, a clinical stage company restoring the beneficial bacteria missing in at-risk infants' gut microbiome to prevent allergic disease before it develops. Their phase 2 data just showed a 64% reduction in atopic dermatitis and a 77% reduction in food allergy development, and the impact held well after treatment stopped. This is a conversation about the science, the system, and what it actually takes to build a prevention company from scratch. I'm Christopher Wilson. This is Stories in Life Sciences. Let's get into it.
This is Stories in Life Sciences brought to you by MedAccess AI, where we explore how ideas move from discovery to real-world impact.
Nikole Kimes, CEO of Siolta Therapeutics, on today. I'm super excited to dig more into the gut microbiome and how you're looking at that at the very early stage of life at Siolta Therapeutics. And where are you calling in from today, Nikole?
I am here in San Carlos, where the lab is located. We're in the Bay Area in California.
And I always like to start with, I know a little bit about this because we've already talked, but I feel like your transition into pharma and biotech is a unique one, and where you started previous to that. Can you dig in a little more to that story and what led you to UCSF and the beginning of the company?
I definitely did not have a straight and narrow path to where I am today. I always had an interest in science, so I'll start there. And my biggest issue was that I had just as much passion for human health as I did environmental sciences. And somewhere intuitively, it felt like those two things should be linked, but there really was no discipline or study area that put those two things together. So I sort of bounced back and forth between studying environmental science and being interested in human health and trying to figure out how I could navigate those. And to make a long story short, moving forward, I had the opportunity to do my Ph.D. at the Medical University of South Carolina. That was doing environmental science at a medical university. And the idea was really to think about how we could find potential drug targets or entities used for drugs from environmental systems. But what it provided for me was an introduction to microbial ecosystems. In any ecosystem, whether it's coral reefs, wetlands, or the human body, we have millions and trillions of microscopic organisms that live together in these really dynamic and complex communities, and they drive a lot of the environmental conditions for that ecosystem. So they can really be at the heart of the health of any given ecosystem. It was in studying these community dynamics and their ability to impact so much around them that I started to get the aha feeling of this is how our environment and our human health are linked, is that we have these complex, redundant, interactive communities of organisms that are taking in environmental cues and parameters and nutrients, and they're using them and manipulating them in a way that then gets passed on to whatever ecosystem. Did a lot of research with coral reefs and how changing environmental conditions in the oceans, whether it was warming temperatures or acidification, how that impacts these microbial communities. And they, in turn, were driving a lot of the disease that we're seeing associated with coral reef die-offs over the last couple of decades. You know, when you start thinking about that and applying that to other ecosystems, mainly for me, it was the human ecosystem. It began to scratch the itch of how we're all connected in some way and how our environment really does play a big role in our overall health outcomes as humans. So really helped me tie it all together there from a scientific perspective. The leap into entrepreneurship with the company was a whole nother dynamic. That occurred later down the road.
How did that transition happen? So you're studying coral reef, and then how did you end up then at UCSF?
A lot of the technology for which we use, whether it's the statistics or the sequencing, any of the machine learning algorithms that we apply to microbial ecosystem studies, those are at the heart of what we now know about the human microbiome. Having a background in the environmental side was very helpful in learning all of the techniques used and the underlying theories of ecological systems. I knew at that point I wanted to take that information and shift it back to human health. So that was when I started searching for somebody who was doing human microbiome research and doing it from a perspective that was a broader systems biology, ecological theory, rather than thinking about just individual pathogens driving a specific disease. In looking for that connection, that's how I found my co-founder and mentor, Susan Lynch. She is professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She's also the director of the Benioff Center for Microbial Medicine now. And she was doing some really cool research that was looking at how the developing gut microbiome is driving or is related to different diseases, particularly chronic diseases like allergic disease, which would include atopic dermatitis, food allergy, asthma, all of those types of diseases. And so it was really her early work that inspired me to jump over to this particular arena of human health.
Yeah, it just makes sense what I saw on your website initially, how you had a photo of a coral reef, and just to think about that visually, that's as complex as what is happening in here, like in our
100%.
microbiome.
Yeah, you are only half human. When you think about this on a cellular level, you have just as many microbial cells as you do human cells. And what's even cooler is we always think about the human genome and how much that drives our health. Well, you have 100 times more microbial genes than you do human genes. So it just makes sense that they would have a very large impact on our physiology and health outcomes.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And what drove her and you to start studying that, or how did you study that at the newborn level? Thinking that there was a call to, it makes sense to look at this at the beginning. And then how did you start looking into that?
From a theoretical perspective, we know in environmental systems that typically you start with a relatively naive ecosystem. There's introduction of what we refer to sometimes as founder species or keystone species. And these are important early adopters to a particular niche. And then they really dictate the rest of the biodiversity that comes subsequently. And that's in any ecosystem. You apply that to a human, and at birth, we're born relatively naive from a microbial perspective. There's debate as to whether you're sterile or not sterile, but in any case, it's certainly a relatively small amount of microbes associated with us at birth. And then very quickly, within hours and days, you see this diversification. And then you really, over the first year of life, you see the vast majority of the increase in the number of organisms associated with your gastrointestinal system. And then another 2 years of variability where it's in flux. Around the age of 3 is when we think it starts to level out into more of a stable microbiome. So that early time period where we know there's a lot of flux made sense that was an important time period, and a time period that might be a window of opportunity, a window where if we could learn enough and understand enough that we might be able to intervene when something goes awry.
Why do you think that it is off now? Like, what has caused that ecosystem to be altered now in a way that seems like a lot of these issues like atopic dermatitis are much more prevalent in these allergies today? And do you know what's causing that?
I'll go back to allergic disease for this. One of the reasons to look at the microbiome, the way this started Sue's early work was collaborating with birth cohorts and really trying to understand what were the risk factors for developing allergic disease. And a lot of the risk factors that had been identified from large epidemiological studies across really diverse populations were identifying things such as mode of birth, nutritional substance early on, were you breastfed or formula fed, certainly medications, whether taken maternally before birth or during birth, as well as introduction of antacids or antibiotics to infants during the early years. All of those were coming up as risk factors, and we know all of those drastically impact the gut microbiome. Okay. So it was the linking of those risk factors to impacts on the early life microbiome that made us start to hone in as to whether we could move beyond seeing it just as a fingerprint of potential disease, but actually trying to understand the mechanisms by which it would be impacting those diseases.
That makes sense. Sounds like there's a variety of different factors, which makes sense.
It does. I mean, what we can say is the rapid increase of allergic diseases over the last couple decades, 80s and 90s, we started to see asthma go up pretty drastically. And now we're seeing that in food allergy and atopic dermatitis. With the rate at which those were increasing, although there is a small genetic component, it couldn't explain the overall increase that we were seeing. So there had been a consensus that allergic diseases were environmentally driven diseases to some extent, but trying to hone in on exactly what environmental parameters were driving that is where we started to really focus in on the gut microbiome early in life.
Okay, that makes sense. And then at what point when you're studying this, clearly there's a problem. Yeah. And you found where there's a link potentially to the gut microbiome. And then where did it come into play where you actually think that this turns into a company that we could actually create something to help solve this problem?
I would say where we started to get really excited was when we were looking at animal models and starting to understand the cellular mechanisms that we were impacting. To date, what drug development does really well is when you have a very specific target and you can make, a molecule that's going to impact that target specifically. And we can, alleviate symptoms because you're hitting a very specific pathway. And we've done that really well. So, there are therapies that we can use to treat allergic diseases at this point in time. We were able to alter the underlying immunological cascade that causes allergic inflammation. And it's the same cascade causes atopic dermatitis as food allergy, as asthma. It's just the downstream inflammatory symptoms that are occurring in a different place or in a different manner that really ends up characterizing different diseases. But the underlying immunological cascade is the same. And once we knew we were able to actually impact that underlying cascade, we started recognizing that prevention was possible. It wasn't just about treating downstream symptoms, but that we could actually get at the underlying cause potentially. And that was really exciting. This is what everybody wants. Nobody wants to have a lifelong chronic disease. You would like that to never happen. That was definitely when it first got exciting. That was also when it got really hard. Because what we realized at that point, when we started looking around and talking to people, that translating what we were seeing and wanted to do into a therapeutic that could actually go and help patients, the system is not created in a way to support that process. We are much better at developing drugs to treat symptoms than we are at getting at underlying cures for prevention. And that was when we were challenged with the question of, okay, who's going to actually do this? Who is going to translate this from the basic science into something that will one day help patients to never experience allergic disease? We couldn't answer that question. So that was when the shift happened for me, particularly to leave academia. We started Siolta Therapeutics in 2017. Since then, it has been almost a decade of building out every vertical necessary to develop a drug because it is a new modality, and we've had to start from the the bioinformatics in combination with clinical data to building out biobanks so that you have the material to actually make products, to doing the experimentation to optimize the actual consortia that we are using currently, to manufacturing, learning how to actually make and scale these organisms. And these are not the organisms that you would find in most probiotics on the shelf. These are organisms that are specific to the human gastrointestinal system. They grow in different ways. Many of them are anaerobic, so they can't be exposed to oxygen. So really figuring out the nuances of how you do that. And then also taking it into the clinic and how do you set up studies for prevention in a manner that is reasonable, both in funding and time, to prove the concept of what you're doing. And that's where we find ourselves today, is coming to the conclusion of those proof of concept studies in humans that give us even more confidence that we're on the right track.
Yeah, the layers of complexity, building this within a system that economically the model is not set up to be conducive, to be helpful for.
Well, and it's interesting because it's hard to know whether it's the system or the dogma of the system. There are examples of prevention. For example, PrEP for HIV prevention. That is a preventative medicine in an at-risk population, and that has been shown to be economically viable. It's had a very large market for quite some time. So it is doable, but it is certainly not the normal route to go. So that's the balance of trying to work within a system that we have, but pushing it to the ends of the spectrum to try and incorporate more of the preventative aspect of it.
I would think the prevention too is different when you're talking about at birth as opposed to later on in life, just from an economic standpoint. But also, I'm just curious, that's another, I would think, challenge is who you're studying in. To do clinical trials in newborns is not simple from my experience.
True. I would say, as with everything, challenges and opportunities. So yes, very rarely do you have companies that focus on going into newborn infants as their primary focus. It does get done, but it is more difficult. Typically, you develop drugs in adults and then you work your way down to children. But in this case, it was very obvious, scientifically speaking, of why we would want to start in newborns. It is, clearly where we could have the most opportunity to intervene in immune modulation that has gone awry, and really trying to support immune tolerance rather than inflammatory activation. Scientifically, it makes a lot of sense. Clinically speaking, it is more difficult from that perspective, but you also have the opportunity, and this is going to be on both sides of the financial equation that we talk about, of prevention being hard. But when you're preventing a disease from birth, that's a lifetime of chronic medical management that you can alleviate from our healthcare system. Definitely challenges and equally opportunities associated with overcoming those challenges.
And is that partly, you feel like, what helped you with the FDA in terms of that fast track status, with the fact that there wasn't being addressed and that you could have that long-term prevention for chronic conditions?
You would have to ask the FDA what
I can't.
what
I don't know
drove
what they
them
would say.
to
I don't know
be
how to get a hold of them.
supportive. But typically speaking, the FDA is really focused on safety. And the reason we are protective of newborn babies is because we want to make sure that we are using safe products. So you want to test your products in older constituents before you're putting it into an infant. That being said, it really depends on what the product is. And what the FDA recognized, I would imagine, is that we are using naturally occurring organisms that are part of a healthy infant's developmental process. We would assume that that makes it a much safer product than your typical drug intervention. And what we've shown is that it is very safe and tolerable in our most recent proof of concept study.
Yeah, that makes sense. Your phase 2, I was reading about. It's super exciting, the results that you all have gotten.
The premise behind this study is based on previous clinical data. We were able to identify organisms in functionality that's missing in those kids that go on to develop allergy or asthma. the concept was that we could replenish that with a defined cocktail of organisms. And the way this study is set up is using this defined consortia. This is something that you just take orally. So it's a dried powder that gets put with breast milk or formula and given orally to the infants on a daily basis. You would give it the same way you would vitamin D or an antibiotic in a young infant through just a dropper. By altering or supplementing the gut microbiome over that first year, that we are impacting immune modulation and trying to support immune tolerance or the immune training that happens over the first year of life. And in doing so, we would expect to reduce the incidence of IgE-mediated diseases. And I use that term specifically. It references multiple allergic diseases. So we're looking at atopic dermatitis, food allergy, asthma. I'll say allergic rhinitis as well. The kids aren't old enough to get allergic rhinitis, but that would be in the same category. So we treat for that first year and are looking to see if we can reduce the incidence of those diseases. And what we found at year 1 is that we reduced the odds of developing atopic dermatitis by 64% and the odds of developing food allergy by 77%. So we do find that to be extremely exciting. We are also, after the 1 year of treatment, we also followed the kids for a second year. Now, there's no longer any supplementation going on. What we're trying to find out is if there's durability of that impact when you stop taking the intervention. Data that we now have has not been made publicly available, but I can say that we are seeing durability of impact. Not only are we seeing durability of impact of atopic dermatitis and food allergy, but we actually do see a reduction in asthma as well at 2 years of age, which we can now diagnose at 2 years. It's an early diagnosis. In future studies, we will want to follow kids even longer because typically asthma is diagnosed between 2 years and 5 years of age. So to get a full understanding of that picture, we want to go longer. But this data is suggesting that we can reduce the incidence of multiple allergic diseases and that the impact of that is durable for at least 2 years.
That's exciting. It just makes sense too. I mean, who knows what else could be prevented, like starting from scratch with a healthy gut microbiome, as opposed to trying to fix it all throughout life later on. So earlier, when you were mentioning this cocktail, like that, when I'm thinking of how did you develop, like what actually to mix, to put in? I mean, just replicating like a healthy microbiome, and then how's that established? What is a healthy version?
So we are doing a defined consortia of bacteria. So the process was starting with clinical data. We have clinical data from other birth cohorts, and you can compare the microbiomes of the kids that develop disease versus those that don't. And in that comparison, you start to see organisms that are, in the case of allergic disease, that you're lacking. You're missing some of these keystone species we talked about earlier associated with healthy immune development. You're starting with that comparison. We were thinking about was the overall functional role that these organisms are playing. How can you minimize the number of bacteria that you need to introduce, but maximize the functional capacity that they embody, really trying to moderate the number of organisms that you have to optimize for, but not losing functional breadth that they bring to the table. And that allowed us to get to a smaller subset of organisms. And then we went into the lab and we actually did experimentation to see where there was synergies between the different organisms to hone into the final mixture that we're using today. It really all starts with clinical data, and then it's optimization around functional capacity, and then it's experimentation for the final optimization piece of it.
Wow. And that being said, there's other different modalities that you feel like this same approach could work in that you're also working on as well?
The microbiome is associated with so many different aspects of health that 100% this is a new modality that we will see in the future for lots of different indications. There's already approved products in infectious disease. So Clostridium difficile is a really problematic infection that often occurs in hospitals, and there are approved products based on microbial interventions to prevent the recurrence of C. difficile infections. Those are already on the market. We specifically have focused on both a rare pediatric disease indication called necrotizing enterocolitis, NEC, as well as women's health in focusing on recurrent bacterial vaginosis. And often we're asked, how in the world did you come up with three, divergent disease indications? But there's actually a thought process behind this that really connects all of these, in that at the end of the day, what we are passionate about is prevention of lifelong chronic diseases. And what we know is that women's health, particularly the vaginal microbiome, is driving women's health, which drives infant outcomes.
Yeah.
Infant outcomes are driving both infectious diseases and long-term chronic. It's really just steps along the path to getting at the healthiest start to life that one could have.
Yeah, what may seem like very divergent actually are very aligned and thought out. If you look at it that way, it makes sense. That's exciting to see where this is going to go next. But I'm sure, and as you spoke to, a fair share of challenges along the way, blazing a new pathway and a lot of different aspects of it. What's been something that's surprised you the most as you've launched this venture and gone through this, 10 years, almost 10 years in?
There's so many along the way. This is challenges and opportunities all wrapped up in one. Yeah. I am surprised often in how many areas we don't have the answer yet. And that also leaves green space for us to design and figure out how to move forward in innovative and creative ways. I have seen along the way there is great passion and motivation for prevention of disease. People really do want more health in their healthcare. That has not wavered. And if anything, I think people are getting more educated and feeling even stronger about that. Not so much the surprising, but the challenging part of it is our system wasn't designed in that manner. So really having at every turn challenge sort of the traditional dogma of how we approach either drug development or healthcare in general. A lot of the hurdles we face in drug development are coming from the next step pressures of how insurance is going to pay for something, or how it will be adopted from a commercial sense. In those areas, we don't have a lot of examples of how we implement the preventative side of the equation. So really continuing at every level of development to having to push forward in a new thought process for most people involved. It's also what makes it the most rewarding piece of what we're doing, is that we are really truly trying to change the fundamental way we approach health.
Yeah, I know that hasn't been easy. We were talking about, because I think last time I spoke to you, were recently coming off JPM, and kind of leaving with a feeling of hope, I guess, for some things that are shifting, just like you spoke to. But like you also mentioned, it feels like some of the other sides of the equation haven't really caught up to that yet, just the economics or the pay structure or how that's going to be, how you're navigating that aspect of it, the reimbursement side of it, and then looking at navigating. I'm sure that affects conversations with VCs or funding, and how you've navigated that pathway.
The navigation there is difficult. Again, people's gut reaction often is, oh, we don't do prevention, or there's no money in prevention, or, if we prevent a disease, then you're going to take away all of the therapeutic revenue. Those are just initial reactions. I haven't seen any example of where that is actually 100% true. What we know is that most of us want to see chronic diseases be alleviated. And there is rarely going to be a time that we're going to be able to do that 100%. But even if we do, that's going to take decades. And there are, economic models that will profit. There's plenty of examples of where there are economically viable drugs that do approach prevention. Nowadays, we're looking at GLP-1s. This is, a
Yeah.
huge investment in the market right now. You will often hear it referred to as treatment of pre-diabetes. That is simply prevention of diabetes in a targeted population.
Yeah.
And again, that goes back to what PrEP has been shown to be able to do for HIV. It's been done. So it can be done. We just have to get people past the initial hesitancy or reluctance of thinking that it cannot be done. Insurance perspective, that's an area where we need to push and demand more from
Yeah.
our insurance companies. And it depends where you're going to market it. If you are looking at a market like Europe, where you have more of an overarching system, that prevention makes a lot of sense. It's easier to understand how that's going to provide economic benefit. Our insurance system, which is very disparate and has many different parties, is a little bit more difficult in that everybody is thinking about how can they make money sooner rather than later, because people might switch out of their program into somebody else's program. That being said, if everybody's covering it, then even somebody coming into your program would be saving you money because it would have been covered earlier by somebody else. So if everybody's doing it, then you still get the benefit, but that's not typically their initial thought process.
That makes sense, because that's what I was thinking. If they're not the ones that were covering that initially, and then that person's healthier later, but they move on to a different plan. But if everybody's doing it, then that makes sense. It's like pushing people.
If everybody's covering it, then even if you're switching, you're all still gaining the benefit.
And how does that look as far as how you're looking at commercialization? I mean, US first and then Europe, or both, or?
That is an open question at this moment in time. We would love to do as many areas as possible, and that is just a resource question at this moment in time. So we're looking at partners that can help really diversify where we would do it. Clearly, we're a US-based company. We have done our initial phase 2 study was in both Australia and the US. We would like to expand that to both Europe and Asia, also seeing increased allergic disease. Europe has some of the highest allergic disease incidence rates. In Asia, this used to be considered more of a westernized disease, but we are now seeing even across Asia and lots of other countries, it's becoming more of a problem in those areas as well. So it really is a global issue.
Wow, that's that ecosystem that you were speaking to. Like,
Yeah.
it's all connected.
Yeah, and it's
So-
interesting when you think about that connection. We do think about, from a microbiome perspective, there are geographical differences. Somebody coming from Asia, their microbiome is going to be different than somebody coming from the US. Looking at the early development of the microbiome, the way it is initially colonized and then diversifies is pretty universal across geographies. There may be, strain-specific differences, but the overall trend of diversification and functionality that is associated with those communities is actually much more similar in those first years of life. That's really based on nutrition. Early in life, we have sole source nutrition, whether it's breast milk or formula, and that drives a lot of what you see in the microbiome. And then you have the transition to solid foods. What solid foods you transition to might be different, but there is that general transition that occurs. So this is something that we think will be useful across different geographies.
Yeah, everywhere. That's exciting to see what comes next. On that note, what are you excited about for what's next?
I am excited about the next stage of development that actually gets us to a product on the market, so that
That's a fun
the
time.
patients who need this can have it. So where we are right now, we just finished up our phase 2 proof of concept study, and we would like to move into a pivotal study for phase 3 development, which we would then apply for a BLA for licensure of this as a drug to get it to the market. So we have that phase 3 development to go through.
Okay, exciting. Any advice for other founders looking at, preventative type of pathways like you're looking at? I know it's like molecules, like you said, it's like the system designed to know how to fund those. So
Yeah.
any advice that you have to not discouraged and push forward?
Be very passionate about what you're doing because you're going to need the fortitude. Don't take no for an answer because a lot of times people haven't really thought through why they're saying no. When somebody said this is just going to be too hard, or nobody's done that before, we would not have gotten very far. And so you really just have to be willing to push boundaries. Follow the science. If the science is telling you you can do it, then keep going.
I like that. That gives me hope. Yeah, there's a way. There is a way.
There is a way.
Passion helps. That I'm sure. I was going to ask you what keeps you going.
Part of it's passion, and the other side is pragmatism. Like, it just makes sense to me.
Yeah, that does make sense to me too.
And I can't imagine. It hurts my brain not to do it. It feels like that would be a failing to not pursue this, just because it's hard and not the way it used to be done. That it just doesn't seem like a acceptable answer.
I like that. I feel like there's like two different things. Some people can be really excited about like a science or a project, but what you spoke to is kind of the next level too. I feel like it's where it's just you have to do this. Like like there's just, you see this, you find it, and I'm sure when you explored it and found it, it's like I have to do this.
Well, and for me it was somebody has to do this. And then I just couldn't find who that somebody was. And when you look around the room and nobody's speaking up, it usually means you're the one who needs to.
Like anybody?
Yeah. Surely somebody wants to do this.
Well, thank you for doing that. This is a real problem, and starting it from the base level. And gosh, there's so much money and energy being spent on trying to fix this later on down the road for people. And you're starting at the beginning, using anything that I feel like just makes sense to me. We're using our natural to recreate that natural structure that's been disrupted from the environment. Just makes sense. But doesn't mean that it's easy to do it.
I know.
That's for sure.
No. But certainly, evolution and our biology has worked on this problem for a very long time. We're just trying to help supplement and support that process to get it back in line with what we see in healthy development.
Perfect. Well, on that note, Nicole, how can people find you and then keep track of what's going on at Siolta? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so we do have a website. I'm assuming you'll post a link to the website because it's a long name, but it's SioltaTherapeutics.com is the best way. And we are on LinkedIn, Facebook, and the website's probably the best.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing this on the shelf. Well, it won't be on the shelf exactly, but it'll be in the hospital.
Well, and not even in the hospitals, right? I don't know if McCary is correct and everything that's safe is over the counter. Who knows? But it's something that would be prescribed by a physician to a targeted population that is at risk for allergic disease.
More prevention.
Right?
I think if more people listen to this, it's just like, yeah, this makes sense. And this is what people should be supporting out there as consumers get more educated on what's happening. So yeah, it's just exciting for me that we're moving to this direction as opposed to just treating some of the symptoms of things that occur in this world. Well, thanks so much, Nicole. I really enjoyed it today and learning more about what you're doing. And yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes from here. Yeah,
thank you very much for having me. I appreciate you highlighting fun and cool science.
You've been listening to Stories in Life Sciences, sponsored by MedAccess AI, where we explore people, ideas, and breakthroughs shaping the future of biotech and healthcare innovation. To learn more, visit medaccessai.org and subscribe on YouTube to watch the full conversations and new episodes as they launch. I'm Christopher Wilson. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep shaping the future one story at a time.